Welcome to the Tarantula Collective. My name is Richard, and today we're talking about the different types of tarantula enclosures and how best to set them up. We all know there are over 1,000 different species of tarantula, but they can all be broken down to about 4 different types. And that is fossorial, terrestrial, semi-arboreal, and arboreal. And within those 4 different types, there are 4 different sizes: Spiderling, juvenile, subadult, and adult. Now, what makes the difference between a Spiderling and a juvenile is going to depend a lot on what species they are. But there's a really simple rule of thumb that will help you decide what the right size of enclosure is for whatever tarantula you have. For terrestrial and semi-arboreal species, I always recommend an enclosure at least 3 times the leg span of the tarantula in horizontal space, at a minimum. And for fossorial and arboreal tarantulas, you want a minimum of 4 times the leg span of the tarantula in vertical space. There are other things to take into consideration, which we will talk about later in the video. But when you're trying to determine the perfect size for your species, it's a basic rule of thumb that will serve you well. And one question or comment I get a lot is people that want to put spiderlings in large enclosures. It's a topic I've discussed in multiple videos in the past, and logically it seems like it's a good idea because you won't have to rehouse the tarantula. You see this a lot with people getting their first old world tarantula and are nervous about rehousing. So they want to put that tiny sling in the adult enclosure and just let it spend the rest of its life in there. The issue with putting a tarantula in an enclosure that is too large is, one, it could be very easy for that spiderling to escape through any of the ventilation holes or cracks in the doors or lids. Secondly, it'll be very difficult to see the tarantula and keep an eye on it, make sure that it's growing well and that it's molting and eating and all that stuff. And the third main reason you don't want to do that is because it can be very difficult for the spiderling to even find the food. Tarantulas are opportunistic feeders. They don't track and hunt their food like a cheetah. They wait for the prey to cross their path and pounce on it. So if the enclosure is too large, there's always a possibility that cricket or roach or mealworm may not get close enough to your spiderling's burrow for them to even realize there's food in there. So you want to always keep your species in an appropriate sized enclosure. So let's talk about the different types of enclosures. So to start off, we're going to talk about fossorial enclosures. Whether it's for a spiderling, juvenile, subadult, or an adult, you want that enclosure to be filled at least 2/3 to 3/4 with substrate. They're going to want to do a lot of burrowing, so the more depth you can give them, the better. It's always nice to give them a starter burrow, either by using your finger to push in there or a pin or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to use it. And you want to be sure to leave enough space in the top of the enclosure for a water dish and maybe some plants or branches, because they will occasionally walk around on the top, and a lot of fossorial species like to web up the area around their burrow. So you want to give them plenty of room to do that and some anchor points for them to attach their web. For spiderlings, I like to use a Tarantula Cribs Spiderling enclosure filled up about 2/3 with substrate. For juveniles and subadults, I'm using the medium Tarantula Cribs enclosure, either the square, cube, or the 360 enclosures. But any enclosure of relative size that you want to use will definitely work. Cross ventilation is not as important for fossorial species since they're down in their burrow 95% of the time, but it's not a bad idea to have some available if you can. The next type of enclosure is a terrestrial setup. This is for species of Aphonopelma, Grammostola, Brachypelma, tarantulas like that. Now for a terrestrial enclosure, you want the substrate to be filled up about 1/2 to 2/3. Most terrestrial tarantulas are opportunistic burrowers, meaning in nature they'll use abandoned burrows of reptiles or mammals. So if you give them a hide and maybe dig out the substrate a little bit, they more than likely will use that as their burrow. So you fill the enclosure up at least halfway with substrate, provide them a cork bark hide or whatever hide you have available, a water dish, and maybe a few decorations, and you're good to go. I highly suggest cross ventilation and top ventilation for terrestrial species. But if you're unable to provide cross ventilation, just make sure there is adequate top ventilation. Too much top ventilation, like using a screen on an aquarium, can be an issue, but can be easily remedied by blocking off part of the airflow, either using acrylic or some other means, so the enclosure doesn't dry out too quickly. Now real quick, before we move on to the other two types of enclosures, I want to take a moment and thank the sponsor of today's video, Pinchers Pokies Exotics, which is a company that I've used and recommended many times over the years, and I'm very excited that they're the sponsor of today's video. Amanda and Eric, the husband and wife team behind Pinchers Pokies Exotics, have been running this mom and pop operation based out of Goose Creek, South Carolina since 2012. They have a wide variety of tarantulas available for sale, but that isn't even the half of it. At pinchersandpokies.com, you can also find a great selection of other exotic pets like scorpions, centipedes, blue death feigning beetles, roaches, tailless whip scorpions, and even some reptiles and amphibians. They are constantly adding more species to their website, so be sure to check back often. And right now, for viewers of this video, they are offering a very special discount. You can save $50 off the Theraphosa blondi when you use the promo code TCBLONDI at checkout. They also have on sale right now the Carabina versicolor, Losiodora pariabana, Davus pentiloris, Chromatopelmus cyanopubescens, B. minax, and a few others. Plus, there is even bulk discounts for multi-packs and group deals available. So head over to pinchersandpokies.com right now and check out their amazing selection. And don't forget to pick yourself up a T Blondie. Thanks again for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to the content. Now, the third type of enclosure is also the source of some frustration and controversy. One of the downsides to making videos is sometimes just to keep things short and concise, you edit explanations down, and sometimes not 100% of the information gets out there. Or people watch your videos and only half listen or remember wrong and will attribute things to me that I never said, which is what's happened a lot with the Semi-Arboreal Enclosure discussion. Maybe people hear the word Semi-Arboreal and assume that it means Arboreal Enclosure, but we're going to address that misunderstanding right now. A Semi-Arboreal enclosure needs to be a terrestrial enclosure set up slightly different. This is for species like Harpictera pulchripes, Chromatopelmus cyanopubescens, Monocentrophus balfouri, or even the orange baboon tarantula, Pteronoculus murinus. Species like this are technically terrestrial, but in captivity they do show some arboreal tendencies, meaning they like to web up a lot above the surface, and sometimes will hang out slightly above the substrate level. So one thing you definitely don't want to do for these species is set them up in an arboreal enclosure. That could be very dangerous. You want there to be more width than height, or the enclosure to at least be acute. If there's more height than width, you're using an arboreal enclosure and you're putting your tarantula at risk. An easy way to set up a home for a semi-arboreal species is to use a terrestrial enclosure. A lot of these species like to burrow as well, so you need to make sure you give them plenty of substrate. I suggest filling up that enclosure at least 1/3 to a half full of substrate. What makes the difference between a terrestrial and a semi-arboreal enclosure is that you're going to add a lot of branches, plants, or other decorations for the tarantula to use as anchor points for their webbing. You don't want to use anything that's too sharp, but that could be dangerous for the tarantula if they were to fall on it. But the more branches or cork bark that you provide above the surface is more web anchors that tarantula is going to have, and potentially the cooler their webbing is going to look, and the more extensively they're going to web. Semi-arboreal technically is not even a real classification for tarantulas. It's just a term that we've made up in the hobby to describe this particular behavior in some terrestrial species. So if you only learn one thing from this video and nothing else, please make sure that its semi-arboreal tarantulas are not arboreal and do not need to go in an arboreal enclosure. In addition to setting up plenty of web anchors in the enclosure, you want to make sure they have a water dish and provide them with a hide. Many semi-arboreal tarantulas will still use a hide like an opportunistic burrower, so don't forget that key element in their setup. And finally, the fourth type of enclosure for a tarantula is an arboreal setup. This is for species like Poecilotheria, Avicularia, Carabina, or any other arboreal tarantula. These enclosures need to be higher than they are long or wide. Most species do really well if you provide cross ventilation, so try to find an enclosure that has that available. Dependent on the species, you're going to need anywhere from 1 inch to up to 1/3 of the enclosure filled with substrate. When setting up an arboreal enclosure, keep in mind what type of species is going in there and what kind of behavior they exhibit. Some arboreal tarantulas will web up all around the top of the enclosure, like Avicularia for example, while other species of arboreal tarantula will settle in closer to the ground, typically making web tunnels and dirt curtains curtains around the base of the cork bark. So if it is a tarantula species that tends to do a little bit of burrowing, like some Salmopius tarantulas, you want to make sure you provide them with as much substrate as possible. But other species like Avicularia that don't spend much time near the ground at all, you can get away with only an inch or two of substrate. You want to make sure you provide them with cork bark or other pieces of wood that extend almost the entire height of the cage. When choosing the right enclosure for your arboreal species, you also want to take that into consideration. Will this species web up the top of the enclosure or down near the bottom? If they're a species that tends to web up around the top, you want to make sure it has a side opening so you can feed them and do your maintenance without destroying their web. Because if the enclosure only opens at the top, every time you need to get into that enclosure to do some maintenance or feeding, you're going to be destroying the web that they've worked so hard to build, which can cause them unneeded stress. And one last aspect of an arboreal enclosure you want to make sure you add is a water dish. If it's a species that spends a lot of time near the surface, I'll leave the water dish right at ground level. But if it's a species that spends most of their time near the top of the enclosure, I will find a way to attach a water dish in the top 1/3 of the enclosure. You can hot glue it to the side of the cork bark, attach it to the side of the enclosure with suction cups or magnets. There are a lot of different ways to get the water dish off the ground, so use your imagination. So hopefully this has cleared up some of the misconceptions and set the record straight on exactly what I mean when I say semi-arboreal. And whether you're setting the enclosure up for a spiderling, juvenile, subadult, or adult, the same setup applies, no matter how small or large that enclosure is going to be. If you have any other questions or need further clarifications, be sure to ask that down below in the comments. As always, I appreciate you watching. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for buying Tarantula Collective merchandise, and I will see you next Tuesday.